In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this animation of these autumn birch trees. So we'll be creating some different leaves, and then we'll be creating some leaf clumps, and we'll be creating the main base and the trunk of the tree, and then we'll be using geometry nodes to make these little clumps of leaves. And we'll put those on the top of the trees. And then we'll be using Blender's particle system to make some of the leaves falling out of the tree and blowing in the wind. And for the falling leaves in the animation, I'm going to be using the same method as I used in my recent tutorial that I just posted on how to create falling autumn leaves. But if you haven't seen that tutorial, that's fine. You don't need to follow that tutorial because I'll be showing you how to set that all up in this video. And if you'd like to purchase the project files and help support the channel, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. The links are in the description. And after you watch this tutorial, you can also check out my fall and autumn Blender tutorial playlist to learn how to create some more fall artworks like a pumpkin, some acorns, an apple pie, and some more fall and autumn themed tutorials. Now I am going to be using my procedural white birch tree bark material, and we're going to be putting that on the trees. So if you want to watch that tutorial, the link will be in the description and you can learn how to create that procedural material, and then we'll be importing it into the blend file. Or you can also purchase that material on my Gumroad store and Patreon page. Link to that is in the description, and then you can add it into your projects. Or of course, if you have some other tree bark material, you can just add whatever material you want onto the trees, but I'll be using my procedural white birch bark material. And then I will be using a few other resources online. So here on Ambient CG, I'm going to be downloading this leaf set 007. We'll be using this for the leaves, and I'll just download the 2K JPEG version. And then also to get some nice lighting and a nice background, I'm going to be downloading the Sunflowers Pure Sky here on polyhaven.com. And I'm going to be downloading the 4K version and then also the HDR version, and I'll just download this. So here I am in a new scene in Blender, and my screencast keys will be right down here in the corner so you can see what buttons I'm pressing. So I'm just going to select everything and we'll just delete everything. And I'm now going to be using Blender's sapling tree add-on to make the base of the tree. So let's click here on edit. We're going to go to the preferences, and in the user preferences, if you go over here to add-ons, you can search for sapling and you can turn on the sapling tree generator. Now if you don't see this right here, it might be over here on the get extensions tab. So you might need to search for it here on the extensions, and then you can install the extension, and then you can enable it. Back over here, you can just check mark that button there to enable the sapling tree generator. So I'll just close the user preferences. So now that the add-on is enabled, I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to go down here to curve. And if you go all the way down here, you can see there's going to be a sapling tree generator. So just add this in, and I'll zoom into it. Now you don't want to click on it or move it around or anything, because that's going to get rid of the settings so you can't adjust the add-on. So right after you add the tree, you want to click right behind me here, and that's going to open up the sapling tree settings, and you can play around with many of the settings. What I'm going to do is click here on the load preset, and I'm going to use this Japanese maple. That's the look of the tree that I'm going for. But you can also change all these and see which one you like. Now there are a few settings that I want to change. So some of these branches are really low, so I can take this branch distribution and I can turn this up. So I'm going to turn the branch distribution all the way up to 10 so that the other smaller branches aren't far down and they're only going to be right up here on the top. So now if I select the tree, you can see those settings have gone away, and I can hit tab to go into edit mode, and you can see this tree is actually a curve object. Now what I want to do is select the bottom curve, and I'll bring it down on the z-axis so that the trunk is a bit longer. And I can also press Alt-S, and that is going to scale up the curve handle so that the trunk is a bit thicker. So I'll just do that and make it a little bit thicker. Let's save this project. So I'll click on File and click on Save. And I'll just save this in my project files as tree.blend and just save the Blender file. And then as you're working on the project, you can press Ctrl-S to save it. So let's now set up some lighting. So what I'm first going to be doing is adding in the HDRI that I downloaded. So if you click here on the world properties, I'm going to click on this yellow dot here next to color, and I'm going to choose environment texture, and then I'll click on the open button and open up the HDRI. And so here is the Sunflowers Pure Sky, and I downloaded the 4K HDR version from Polyhaven. So I'll just open this up, and then I can hold down the Z button and move my mouse into that rendered viewport mode. And this tutorial will work great in both the Cycles and Eevee rendering engines. I am going to use the Cycles rendering engine, but you could definitely use Eevee if you want to. Now to make the lighting look a bit nicer and make the colors look a bit nicer, if you click here on the render properties, let's go down here to the color management. And on the look here, I'm going to change this to high contrast just to make everything more saturated and contrasted. And then I also want to get a little bit more direct bright lighting. So I will go to the add menu, and I'm going to go here to light, and I'm going to add a sunlight. sunlight. Let's move the sunlight up here, and I can just rotate the sunlight over like that. And I want to get the sunlight so it's about the same as where this light is here in the scene. So you can see there's this light right up here in the HDRI. So I can double tap the R key to use the trackball rotation, and I can kind of rotate the sunlight around, maybe rotate it over so that it's just adding a bit more brighter light to the scene. And then if I go here to the object data properties, I can turn the strength up to maybe just like a 4 so it's a bit brighter. So I'm now going to be adding in my procedural white birch tree bark material, and I have my Ultimate Blender procedural material pack set up in my Blender file. So I can click right over here on this assets workspace here, and then I have my Ultimate Blender procedural material pack. If you want to check out my Ultimate procedural material pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials, the link to that product will be in the description. So here on the search, I can just search for bark, and you can see here's the white birch tree bark material. So I'll go into the rendered viewport mode, and then I can just drag and drop the material there onto the bark. And then if you click over here to go to the shading workspace, you can select the tree, and here is the white birch tree bark material. So there's lots of settings you can use to customize the material. Now, if you don't have my Ultimate procedural material pack, but you've done this tutorial, or if you've purchased the material as an individual material on my Gumroad store, I'll show you how to import the material. So what you can do is you can click on File, and then you can click on Append. And then you can locate to the Blender file where you have the white tree bark material. So I'll go inside the Blender file, and then you can go to material. So here's the material folder, and then you can just click on that and click on the append button. And then once you do that, if you select the object and go here to the material settings, you can click on the drop down and you can add the white birch tree bark material. So now I'm going to change a few of the settings to make it look a bit different. So one thing that I want to do is turn off the displacement, because if I zoom pretty close here, you can see there is a bit of displacement, which is kind of bringing it in. But here on the displacement strength, I'll turn this to 0, so it's not using any of that displacement. And then also on the scale here, I'm going to turn this to like a 0.6. I think 0.6 looks a bit better. And then here on the patches amount, if I turn this up, you can see there's going to be less patches, and I want the bark to be a bit more white. So I'll turn the patches amount to a 1.2, so you can't see as many of those dark patches. And then also, if you're using Blender Eevee and the material is a bit laggy, some things you can do to make the material less laggy is you can turn down the bump strengths. That'll make it less laggy in Blender Eevee. And another thing you could do is turn down the detail. Now, I don't need the patches detail to be that high quality, so this patches detail, I can turn this way down to a 6, and so it still looks pretty detailed, but it's not quite as detailed. You could also hit the tab key to go into the node group, and you could check over these noise textures, and you could turn these detail levels down if you want to. So you could turn the detail levels down of all these noise textures. So if you're using Blender Eevee, turning these detail levels down will make it a bit less laggy. But that's looking pretty good for my scene, so I'm just going to leave the other settings how they are. So let's now create the leaves. So I'm going to go back over here to the layout, and I'll go back into solid view, and I'm now going to be adding in the leaf as a mesh plane. So I'll go to the add menu, and I can go here to image, and I'm going to add a mesh plane. So here's the leaf set 007, and again I downloaded the 2K JPEG version. So I'm just going to go inside this folder, and then here we have all the textures. Now I don't need to use all the textures, I am just going to be using 4 of them, but right now I'm just going to select the color one and then click on import images as planes. So now I'm going to move this over, and I will go into the rendered viewport mode to see it. Now I want to add in all the other textures, so I'm going to click over here to go to the shading workspace, and let's just zoom into the object. And I'm going to be using the principled texture setup to set up all the textures. Now the principled texture setup uses the node wrangler. So if you don't have the node wrangler enabled, you can click on edit, you can go to the preferences, and then here in the add-ons tab, just search for node and enable the node wrangler add-on. So what I'm going to do is select this color map and hit X to delete it, and then I'll select the principled shader and press Ctrl-Shift-T. And Ctrl-Shift-T will bring up Blender's file browser, and you need to just locate to the folder where you have the images. So I'm going to select the color map, hold down the Control key, and I'm going to select the normal GL, the opacity, and the roughness. So just those 4 maps, and I'll click on Principled Texture Setup. So now you can see it looks a lot more realistic. It has all of the bump there, and it has some custom roughness and the base color. And also around the leaves, it is transparent. So I'm going to rotate the leaves, so I'll rotate them on the z-axis by 90 degrees and hit enter so they're over this way. So if I press 7 on the numpad for top view and kind of move this over, you can see the leaves are pointed back. So let's click back over here to go to the layout, and then I'm going to hold down the Z button and move my mouse to the material preview. And I'll hit the period on the numpad to zoom into the object, and we're going to use the knife tool to cut out the leaves. So I'll hit the 7 on the numpad to go to top view, and we're waiting for the material preview mode to load up. Okay, so it's loaded up the texture. So let's zoom into the object, and I'll hit tab to go into edit mode, and I'm going to cut out all the leaves. So I'll zoom into this leaf here, and I'll hit the K button for the knife tool, and I'll click here and then click here and just go along and just kind of cut it out. And it doesn't need to be exact because there is the transparency there, so we can just kind of cut just a rough cut around the leaves, and that extra spot there will be invisible because of the transparency. So go there, click there, and then hit the enter key. You can see now we've cut out one of the leaves. Now you can see it might add a cut here in between this leaf. So if that's happening, you can hit the K button for the knife tool. You can click here and then just click on the end and hit enter. Hit the K button for the knife tool again, and click here and there and then hit enter. So we've cut out this leaf. So then what you can do is you can go to the face select, and you can select both of these faces, and you can press the F key to fill a face. So I can now hit the K button again for the knife tool and just go along here and just cut out the leaf. So it doesn't really need to be perfect, just going along here and just making kind of a low poly leaf here. All right, just like that, there, and then hit enter when you're done with that. So we've cut out the next leaf. So I'm gonna go around and do the same thing for all the leaves. All right, and here is the last one. So hit the K button to confirm that. And now we have all the leaves cut out. So what I'm gonna do is hold down the shift key and select all the faces of the leaves. Then I'm going to press Control I to invert the selection. And I can hit the X button, and we're just gonna delete the faces. So now we have just the leaves. Now if you select the entire mesh, we're going to hit the P key, and we're going to separate by loose parts. So if you go back to object mode, you can see now they are all their own object. Now the origin point of all of them is still in the center. So if we select all the leaves, we're going to click on object, set origin, and we're going to set the origin to geometry. So now all of the origin points are in the center. So I'll select all these leaves, and let me just go to top view again, kind of move these down here. And I'm just going to move them closer so we have all the leaves lined up. Now I want to make these leaves a little bit more three-dimensional to make them look a bit more realistic. So if I select this leaf here, I'll zoom into this one leaf. I'm going to hit the K button for the knife tool again, and I'm going to add a cut here in the center, and then hit the K button again and add another cut right there. And I'm going to continue to do that for all the leaves. So go back to object mode, we'll select this one and go into edit mode, and just add another one there, hit enter, K button again, add another cut there, hit enter, and I'll just do that for all of the leaves. And what you can also do is go into multi-object editing. So if you select multiple leaves and then go into edit mode, you can see it's going to go into edit mode for both of them, and that can just make it a little bit easier. So if you want to do that, you can. Or you can do them each in object mode individually. All right, so now if I select all the leaves and go into edit mode, I'm gonna select each one of the faces here, so just the center faces are selected. And I'll bring the faces up on the Z-axis just like that. And then if I select all the leaves, I'll bring them down on the Z-axis. And then I'll use the object context menu in object mode and shade it smooth, so the objects are shaded smooth. And I can see there's just a little bit of a hump along the leaves, so they just look a little bit more three-dimensional now. Let's click on File and save our project. So I now want to add a little bit of color variation to the leaves, and I want to make them look a bit more realistic and just play around with the materials a little bit and also make them look a bit more orange. So I'm just going to select one of the leaves, and then I'll click here to go to the shading workspace. And here's the material, so let's just edit the materials a bit. So one thing that I want to do is add a bit more bump. Now if I go down here to this normal map here, this normal map is adding kind of a weird, really strong bump to the edge of the leaves, and I don't really like how that is. So on the normal map here, I'll turn the strength to 0.5 so that it looks a little bit more flat on the edges, and that looks a bit better. But then here on the surface, it's a little bit flat, and I want to add a bit more detail. So I'll go to the add menu and I'll search for a bump node, and we'll put the bump node here between the normal map and the principled shader. And then I can take the base color and we'll put the base color into the height value to convert it to bump data so the leaves look really bumpy. But then that is way too strong, so let's turn the bump strength to like a 0.1 so it is more subtle. We can now see kind of those leaves just have a bit more detail there on the surface. and that looks a bit nicer. Now there's another small thing that I noticed with some of the leaves. If I go into edit mode of the leaves, you can see that on the shading there's kind of a little crinkly spot right there, and that looks a bit weird. And that is because there are sometimes just vertices right here which are close to this other vertex, and so there's a line here, so it's just adding a little bit of a shading issue. So what you can do is select this vertex, you can double tap the G key and you can edge slide this vertex over to the other one, and then if you press the A key to select everything, you can hit the M key and you can merge by distance, and then that'll remove that extra vertex. So if you are having issues with that on some of the leaves, you can do that. You can see here's another one where the shading is a bit weird. So if I select the vertex, double tap the G key, edge slide it up, and then select everything, and you can hit M to merge, and you can merge by distance, and that just makes the leaves look a bit nicer. So I also want to edit the base color a bit, so I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for the RGB curves, and we'll put the RGB curves here between the base color and the principled shader. And let's just edit the colors a bit. So the first thing that I want to do is click here to add a dot, maybe drag it down a bit, and then click here to add another dot and maybe drag this one down a bit. And actually this one, maybe I could bring up a little bit more. So I'm kind of adding a bit more contrast by adding that curve there. And then what I also want to do is click here on the G for green, and I can click here to add a dot and then drag the dot way down. And I'm going to drag this pretty far down so that there isn't quite as much green, and that way it'll look a bit more kind of yellowish and orangey. And then what I also want to do is add a bit more variation, so some of them are going to be more yellow, but then other ones will be a bit more orange and red. So to do this, I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for an object info node. We'll drop the object info right up here. Now the object info has this random value. So if I plug the random value into the surface to preview it, you can see the random value is going to make a slightly different color from white to black, and it's going to be different per object. So what I can do is put the random value into a mix color and then make randomly each leaf a little bit more red or less red. So if I go to the add menu, I can search for a mix color. We'll put the mix color right here between the RGB curves and the principled shader, and then the random value can go into the factor. So if I control shift and select the mix to preview it, you can see it is changing the colors a bit. So now here in color B, I'm going to make this kind of like a reddish orangey color. And you can see because of that random value, each one of the leaves is going to be slightly different. So like this one is more yellow, this one is super red, and this one is kind of in the middle. And if you want to use the same exact color I'm using, you can use the same hex value. So on this mix color, color B is going to be a hex value of BA1900. So you can punch that into the hex value if you want to use the same color that I'm using. So let's control shift and select the principled shader now, and you can see the leaves look just a little bit different and there's some variation. So now let's make the clumps of leaves. So I'll just go back over here to the layout, and I can just go into the solid view, and I'm now going to go to the add menu, and I'm just going to go here to mesh, and I'm going to add a plane, and we're going to use this plane to make kind of like a twig or a small branch. So I'll move this plane over, we'll hit tab to go into edit mode, and I can scale the branch down, scale it way down, and also scale it down on the x-axis so that it's really thin. All right, I'll go back to object mode, and we can now add a material to this. So let's go into the rendered viewport mode so we can see the materials. Let's click here on the materials. We'll click on new to add a new material, and I can just call this branch or whatever you want to call it. And then here on the base color, I'm just going to make it kind of like a brownish color. And the hex value for this branch color is going to be a hex value of 68310D. And then also this roughness here, I can turn this up a bit to like a 0.7, so it's a little bit more rough. Now this branch is going to be very small, so I'm not really concerned about adding a texture or making it look realistic because it's going to be quite small. So now what we're going to do is we're going to select all the leaves here, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate, and let's move them over here. And then if I hold down the Shift key and select the branch, I'm going to press Ctrl J. So now you can see they're all the same object. So I'll go to top view. We can also go back into the material preview to see this. And I just want to move the leaves around so that they are coming out of the branch. So to select an individual leaf, you can press the L key with your mouse hovered over that leaf. And that'll just select the vertices which are connected to the leaf. So I'll move the leaf up here. You can scale it and rotate it and just stick it here. Press the L key to select another leaf and kind of scale this one up, move it here, and you can just continue to do that for all the leaves. And we're just going to make kind of a clump of leaves, so the leaves are going to be coming off of that branch. And then rotate this one upside down, and we're going to stick it right there. And then this one here, We'll rotate that over, maybe scale it up a bit, and we'll just stick it right there. And maybe I'll go into wireframe view and just box select all of this part and kind of move it in a little bit so that they're a little bit closer. Maybe box select this part here and kind of move that in so it's a bit closer. So now you can see we just made this little clump of leaves, and also make sure that the leaves are at the same point with the branch. So what I'm going to do is just go into edit mode, and I can hit the L key to select the branch, and I'll move the branch down so that it's kind of level there with the leaves. And then if I select everything, I'll move everything up so that it's right there in the center of the origin point. So there we go, we now have a clump of leaves, and I just want to make one more. So we're going to select this clump here in object mode, and we're going to duplicate it and move it right over here. And also this leaf material, if I double click on this to rename it, I'm just going to call it leaf. All right, so let's go back to this object here. We'll go into edit mode, and I'm just going to delete some of them because for this clump, I'm just going to have 4 leaves. So I'll just hit the L key with 2 of these selected. I'll just select these 2 and I'll delete them. And then if I hit the L key to select this one, I can maybe rotate this and stick it over here so it looks a bit different. Maybe select this one, rotate it over, maybe stick it down there. And then this one here, we'll select this one, maybe rotate it up and stick it over here. We can also box select the edge here of the branch and kind of move it back a bit. Maybe select everything and bring it there into the center. And then if I just select this leaf, I could rotate it and just stick it right there on the very end. So now you can see we have these 2 different clumps of leaves. So now I want to move these into their own collections because we're going to be using them in the geometry nodes. So I'm going to box select both of these clumps. We'll hit the M key. The M key can move them, and I'll click on new collection, and I can just call this leaf clumps. We'll click on create. And now if you open up the outliner here, you can see we have the leaves clump collection. Then let's deselect everything, and we're just going to select all of these leaves here. Let's hit the M key. We can click on new collection, and this one we can just call leaves or individual leaves or whatever you want to call it, and I'll click on create. So now we just have the individual leaves and then the leaf clumps. And then also if we select the tree here, the sapling tree, we can drag this and stick it here into the collection. So in the collection we have the sunlight and the tree. All right, press Ctrl S again to save the project. All right, so now what we're going to be doing is creating some simple clumps, and then we're going to be adding geometry nodes to those clumps, and we're going to make it so that the clumps of leaves are distributed on those objects. So what I'll do is press Shift C to make sure the 3D cursor is in the center of the scene, and I'll go to the add menu, and I'm just going to add a cube, and we'll just move the cube up here, and I can hit tab to go into edit mode, and I'll scale it down a bit. And I can also scale it down on the Z-axis. Then I'll press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, and I'll left click and right click so the loop stays in the center, and I can scale the loop up on the Y-axis, and we'll do the same thing for the other side, so Ctrl R, left click and right click, scale it up on the X-axis, and then if I select this vertex and shift select this vertex, we can scale them up so it's a little bit bigger. So we'll go back to object mode, and this is going to be the simple kind of clump here that we're going to distribute the different leaf clumps on. And we'll also use the object context menu and shade it smooth. So now let's add the geometry nodes to this object. So I'll click here to go to the geometry nodes workspace, and I can zoom into the object, and we'll click on new here to add new geometry nodes. So now we'll create the geometry node setup. So what I first want to do is search for the distribute points on faces node. So we'll add distribute points on faces, drop it here, and then we can also search for the instance on points. So we'll search for instance on points, drop that there. So these are the nodes that we're going to use to put the clumps of leaves on the object. Now we need to add in the collection of objects, so we'll go to the add menu, and we're going to search for the collection info, drop it here, and on the collection type here, we can choose the collection, and we're going to choose the leaf clumps. Now we can put the instance into the instance there on the instance on points. Now there's a problem with this. You can see it's way over here and it's not where the object is, and that's because we need to click on separate children, reset children, and then also the pick instance here. So this way it's going to randomly select the objects and it's going to distribute them on the object here. So if I go into edit mode, you can see I can kind of scale this, and you can see it's basically just distributing them on the faces. Now the objects all have the same rotation, so I want to change the rotation. So what I can do is take the distribute points on faces, we're going to take the rotation value and we're going to put that into the rotation of the instance on points. So it's using the rotation value of these faces to actually rotate the object. So you can see that looks a little bit better now. But then I also want to add a bit of random rotation, so I'm going to search for the rotate rotation node. So rotate rotation, we're going to stick this here between the distribute points on faces and the instance on points. points. So now we have this rotate by, and we can use this to rotate them around. So what I want to do is search for a random value, and the random value is going to give each one of the leaf clumps a random rotation, so it looks more organic and natural. So we'll put the value into the rotate by, but then here I want to take the float, and I want to change the float to vector instead, so we can control the x, y, and z values instead of just using them all at once. And we'll put the value back into the rotate by. So now you can see we have a minimum value and a maximum value, and that's going to be what the random values are in between. So on the minimum, I can leave that to 0. And then here on the maximum, let's turn all of these to 0. So 0 and 0 and 0. So if we take the bottom one here, this is the z-axis, and that'll rotate it around on the z-axis. Now the problem with this is it's not really working correctly, and that's because instead of using the global rotation, which is going to move it up and down on the z-axis here, I want to move it on the local rotation of this object. So we're going to change the global here to local, and now if I rotate this around, you can see it's rotating around on the local z of this object. So if I select this object and rotate it on the z-axis, you can see that's the rotation that I want to rotate it by per object. So if I select the geometry nodes again, I can rotate this around, and I want to make it a random value, so I can type in TAU for tau, and that is a math equation which is going to generate this value here, and that value will make sure it's rotating all the way around randomly. Or you can also just turn the maximum up to a really big value of like 1000, so it's super random, but I can just turn it to tau. Now here on the maximum x and y values, we can just turn this up a little bit, so it just adds a bit more randomness to the x and y. So here on the x and the y, I can just turn this to maybe like a 0.2, and that way you can see they're just moving a little bit on the x and y axis. And then let's go up here to the distribute points on faces, and on the random here, I'm going to change this to Poisson disk, and that way I can add a minimum value, a minimum distance value between all of them. And I'm going to turn the minimum distance to a 0.1, and then I can also turn up this density max here to add more density. So I'm going to turn this density max up to like a 40, so there are a lot more leaves, but you can see the leaves are way too overlapping, and they're also quite big, so I want to make the leaves smaller. So I'm going to search for another random value node, and we'll drop the random value node right here under the rotate rotation, and we can put the random value into the scale. So we now have a minimum value and a maximum value, and we can change the scale of it. So you can see if I turn the scale down, that looks a lot better. You can kind of see how it's generating around the object. So let's turn the maximum to like a 0.6, and then the minimum, I'm going to turn that to like a 0.4, and that looks a little bit better. And then you can turn up the distance min if you want there to be a minimum distance in between them, and of course the density max. So something like that is pretty good. And also I think it could be a little bit more random. So here on this second random value here, the one with the x, y, and z values, I could maybe turn this up to like a 0.4 instead. That looks a little bit better. So the leaves are just moving around at some different random points. So now you can see we have these little clumps of leaves, and I can duplicate the object, and I can scale it and rotate it, and it's just going to generate those leaves around. So let's just move this object down here, and we'll just stick it here on top of the tree. So let's go back over here to the layout, and then I can go into the material preview or the rendered view, whatever you want to do. Actually, the material preview is a little bit laggy because of that material, so I'll just go back to solid view. And I can now go into edit mode, and I can duplicate the object, and just kind of move it over here, maybe scale it down a little bit. Let's just stick it right there, duplicate it again, and maybe I'll scale this up and scale it up on the x-axis and the y-axis so that it's kind of longer, and put it right there. Duplicate it again, we'll make maybe a really small clump, maybe scale it up. And we can just kind of put a clump right over there, duplicate it again. We're just going to stick it there on all of the ends of the tree. So right there, maybe give it a random rotation. I'm just going to continue to do that for the rest of the tree. So just making these little clumps on the top of the tree. You can also add some smaller clumps on top of these bigger clumps if you want to, just to give it a bit more randomness and variation. And of course, you can add other objects if you want to. So in edit mode, you could, for instance, add like an icosphere, and you could maybe make the icosphere settings really small. And you could add like some icospheres if you want to, like that. And let's go into the rendered viewport mode just to kind of see how that's looking. So that's looking pretty nice. It looks like there's a few areas where I should just add a little bit more clumps, so I'll just finish that up by adding a few more clumps to the end of the trees, but that's looking pretty good. All right, now I also want to add a bit of an animation so that when I play the animation, it looks like the leaves are blowing around in the breeze a little bit. So what I'm going to do is select the object and go back here to the geometry nodes, and I'm going to add a basic geometry node setup to make the leaves kind of moving around. So what I'll do is search for a noise texture, and I'll just drop the noise texture down here, and we're going to put the noise texture into a set position node. So search for a set position, we're going to drop the set position here, and then the noise texture color, that can go into the offset of the set position. So now the noise is going to move the set position around. You can see if I change the scale here, you can see that's moving it around, so it looks like it'll be blowing in the wind. And then what I also want to do is kind of control the strength of it. So I'm going to search for a mix color node. We'll put the mix color here after the noise texture, but before the set position. And I can put the color into color B. Then I can take the mix type here, and I'm going to change this to linear light. And then we can take color A and we can make this fully black. So now you can see we have this factor value. So if we turn the factor all the way up to 1, you can see it's kind of distorting it and moving the leaves away and making it look more crazy. Or if I turn this way down, it's not going to control it quite as much. So I'm going to turn this factor to just like a 0.1. And then what I also want to do this noise texture is I want to click on the 3D and I'll change it to 4D instead. And that way we have this W value, which is kind of going to randomize it. So you can see I can change the W value to scale it. And then also on the noise texture settings, I want to turn the scale value just to 1, so it is a lot smaller. So now we can just animate this W value to make it look like the wind is blowing. So I need a timeline. So what I'm going to do is click and drag here in the corner and drag down to split the window. And I can also click and then drag over and let go. And now we have another little window down here. And I'm going to change this type to the timeline. So we can go back here to frame 0. And then I can hover my mouse over the W value and I'll press the I key to inset a keyframe. And then I can drag this over to the very end. And I can drag the W value really high up to maybe like 300, and then hit the I key again to insert another keyframe. And then if I press the A key in the timeline to select the keyframes, I'm going to hit the T key to change the keyframe interpolation, and I'm going to change it to linear to make sure it's just moving without speeding up or slowing down. So now if I press the spacebar to play this, you can see it's way too fast. So if I just select the keyframes, I can scale it way up, and I can scale those keyframes, and I can just change the speed of it. So if I just scale those keyframes up really big, 300 was probably a little bit too much, but you can see if I scale it up really big, now you can see it just looks like the trees are blowing in the breeze. So I'm going to scale them up to a really big value, something like that, so they're moving much slower. So for a 250 frame animation, it looks like right here it's starting at like 91, and then it's going to just like 96. So you can just animate this from like 0 to 5, and that's probably going to be a good speed. But you can really just change the speed to whatever looks good to you. So let's go back over here to the layout and just take a look at this. So now let's create the particle system. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm just going to go down here to mesh, and I'm just going to add a circle. And then here on the circle settings, if you open up the add circle settings behind me, I'll turn the vertices to 16. And then if I go into edit mode, I'll hit the F key to fill a face there. Now let's move this over here, kind of stick it here, go into edit mode, and I can scale it up just like that. And I can just bring it right in here. So this is going to be the emitter object. So this is where the particles are going to come from. So I'm just going to stick it right there inside the tree. So now we can add particles. So let's just open up the side panel here, and we're going to go right over here to the particles. Let's click on the plus here to add a new particle system. And I want to make it so that when I play this, that the leaves are going to fall. So what we're going to do is go down here to render. And on the render type, we're going to change the halo to collection. And then if we click on the instance collection, we're going to choose the leaves. So now if I play this, the leaves are going to fall. Now on this scale here, I want to make this bigger, so I'll turn it to like a 0.7. So now the leaves are a bit smaller. And then on this scale randomness, I'll turn this to like a 0.3, so there's a bit of variation between the randomness. Now that is way too many leaves, so if I scroll back up here, I can turn this number down, and I'm just going to turn this number to like a 200, so there's less leaves. Now when I play the animation, at the starting of the animation, I already want there to be some leaves in the scene, so what I'm going to do on the frame start here is I'm going to make this -400, and that way it's going to start to play the animation way over here at -400, so if I play the animation at the starting, you can see the leaves are already falling. And then on the end frame here, I want to turn this up to like 300, so I'm going to have a 250 frame animation, so it'll end over here at 300. Now I also want to make the lifetime bigger, because if the lifetime is too slow, then it will end before the end of the animation. So here on the lifetime, I'm just going to turn this up to like 1000, so it has a really long lifetime. Now I also want to turn the gravity down so they're not falling quite as fast. So let's scroll right down here, and we're going to open up the field weights. And on the gravity setting here, I'm just going to turn this to like a 0.2. So now if I go back here and play this, you can see now the gravity is a lot less, so the leaves are moving slower. Now the leaves really don't look that that realistic right now because they don't have any rotation. So let's scroll right up here. Let's just close these settings that we don't need here, close this one here, and we're going to check mark the rotation setting. It will open up the rotation, and I'll turn the randomize all the way up to 1. And then if I open this up bigger, the random phase or the randomize phase, I'm going to turn this all the way up to the max of 2. So that'll make a bit of a random rotation. You can see there's now random rotation per leaf. But the problem is that you can see the leaves aren't really rotating as they're moving. So to fix this, we're going to turn on the dynamic, and then as well as that, we're going to open up the angular velocity. And I like to turn up the angular velocity amount to like a 0.3. So now if I play this as well as them falling, the rotation is moving, so they're randomly going to rotate around as they're moving. You can see if I turn up the amount really big on the angular velocity, now they're moving around quite a lot. They're kind of spinning around, but that's a bit too much. I don't want them to be spinning around that much, so maybe just like a 0.3. Now if I go into the rendered viewport mode, you can see that I can still see this plane here. So just to make this plane here invisible in the final render, I'm just going to be adding a material to this. So I'll go to the materials, add a new material here, and on the surface type here, I can change this to transparent, and then just make sure the transparent color is fully white. So now it's transparent and you can't see that plane. So I now want to add some wind so that the leaves are moving kind of to the side. So I'll go to the add menu, we're going to go down here to the force field, and I'm going to choose wind, and we'll move this object over and kind of rotate it over so it's rotating over to the side like that. And then if I click here to go to the physics properties, I can turn the strength up to a 2. And now if I play this, you can see that the leaves are kind of moving over there to the side. Now I want to add a bit more noise so that they're not all moving in the same direction, so there's a little bit of noise. So what I can do is change the noise amount. So this noise amount, I'll turn that up to like a 2. And now if I go back to the start and play this, you can see it just looks a bit more random. If I turn up the noise amount way too much, you can see they're like moving all around and they're kind of dispersed too much. So I just like a noise amount of 2, or maybe you could even turn that up to like a 3 if you want to. And that looks a bit nicer, so they're kind of moving around and they're dispersed just a little bit more. And I think the leaves could be rotating just a little bit faster. So if I select the particle system again, we're going to click back over here to go to the particle settings. And here on the rotation, if you go back to the angular velocity, let's turn this up to like a 10. So that's definitely spinning around way too much. So let's turn it down to just like a 5, so it's half as much. And that's still spinning around a little too much, so maybe just like a 3. So I think a 3 is pretty good, so I'm going to leave it set to 3. So they're just spinning around just a little bit faster, and it's a bit more noticeable. Press Ctrl S to save your project. So we're now ready to set up the final scene. So one thing that I want to do is I want to select the particles, and then I also want to hold down the shift key and select the clumps, and then lastly shift select the trunk. And I'll press Ctrl P, and we're going to set parent to object cube transform so that all of these objects follow around the trunk object. And why I want to do this so that I can move the tree around and then the rest of the objects will follow along. Let's also select all 3 of these objects, and I'm going to press Alt D. So Alt D is going to duplicate the objects, but they're going to keep the same object's data. So I'll just move it over here, and maybe we can rotate this around to give this tree a random rotation. And then I can play this and just watch the leaves falling down. Now I also want to add a camera, so we'll just move our view to right about here, and I'll go to the add menu and I can just add a camera. And then you can move your view to where you want the camera to be, and you can press Ctrl Alt Numpad 0. So Ctrl Alt Numpad 0 will bring the camera to where you are. And if I select the camera, I'll hit G to grab, and then I'll tap the Z key twice, and I can just bring the camera down a bit. And I can also hit R to rotate and double tap the X key to rotate it back and forth there. Just kind of move it around like that, maybe bring it up there. All right, maybe move this tree up a little bbit. Let's go into the rendered viewport mode so we can see how this is looking. And I also want to add a camera boundary, and this only works in cycles render, but you can press Ctrl B in the camera and then drag over the camera and let go, and that'll add a camera boundary, so it'll only render in the viewport what the camera can see to kind of speed up the render time. Let's also maybe rotate the sunlight around so that the trees are a little bit brighter. That looks a little bit nicer. Now it is a good idea to also bake the simulation before you render it, because sometimes some things can happen where the simulation will just stop, so it's a good idea just to bake it before you render an animation. So let's just select the leaves here and press H to hide it, select this leaf here, press H to hide it. So now if I select the particle system, we can open up the cache settings, and I'll just click on bake, and it's just going to go through and bake all those frames. And then once that's done, we'll select the second one here and click on bake and bake that as well, just to make sure the simulation is fully baked. And then another thing I can do to make the render look a bit nicer is I can go here to the render properties, and I can turn on the motion blur. So that will add just a tiny little bit of a blur to the leaves. Now, one problem with the motion blur, if I go to frame 1 and then just give this a quick render by hitting F12 to render, you can see with the motion blur, for some reason it's adding this little streak here. It's adding a streak on the leaves. So I'll hit the escape key to cancel that, and I'll just go back here. Now, I believe why this is happening is because it is simulating the particle system in the negative frames, and so it quickly moves the particles really fast to frame 1 when it starts to render the animation. So that is why we're having the little streaks there. You can see if I go back to the render result, there's some little weird streaks there on the first frame. So an easy way to fix this is to just not render the first frame. So on the start frame here, I'll just turn this to 2. So the start frame is 2 and the end frame is 250, and so that'll still be about a 10-second frame animation. And that way, if I go to frame 2 and then just hit F12 to give this a render, we're not going to have those little streaks there, but there still is just a tiny bit of motion blur. So I'll hit the escape key just to go back. And I can press Alt-H to unhide the leaves. Let's also open up the sampling here. So open up the sampling tab, and let's go to the render samples, and I'm just going to render this with 50 samples. We don't need that many samples. And then I'll also turn on the denoise here, so it denoises every image when it renders it. Now there's just one more small thing that I want to add to make the final render look a bit nicer, and that is that I want to move the camera slowly moving into the scene. So if I just select the camera here, I'm just going to press the K button, and I can insert location. We're now going to go to the very end of the timeline, so just go a little bit past 250, and I'll hit G to grab, and then I'll double tap the Z key, and I'll just move the camera in a bit, like that, and then I'll hit the K button again, and I can insert location. So if I press the spacebar to play this, you can see the camera is going to slowly move into the scene, and what I need to do to see the keyframes is click with the middle mouse wheel and drag down so I can see the keyframes. And the problem with this is that it starts to speed up, and then at the end it slows down. So if you press the A key in the timeline to select the keyframes, we're going to hit the T key to change the interpolation, and we're going to change it to linear. And that way the camera is going to move at a consistent speed. So now the camera is just slowly moving into the scene. So we now need to render these images out to a folder. So let's go here to the output settings, and we can go to the output here, and we'll click on this button to set an output. And in the folder with my project files, I will click on the plus here to make a new folder. Let's call it pics. I will go into the folder and then click on the accept button. And then here on the file format, I'm just going to set this to JPEG, and I'll turn the quality to 100. So the image size is a little bit smaller since we are rendering out a lot of frames, but you could also just set it to PNG if you want to. So then press Ctrl S to save your Blender file again, and then to render this, you can click on render and click on render animation. Alright, and it has finished rendering, so I'll just press Ctrl S to save the file again, and then I'll open up Blender's video editor, so I'll go File, and I'll go to New, and then we can just open up video editing. And then here in the sequencer, we'll go to the Add menu, and we're going to add Image and Sequence. Then we're going to locate to the folder which we have all the files rendered to, so I'll press the A key to select all the images, and I'll click on Add Image Strip. We can just play that and watch the final animation. So then, of course, if you wanted to, you could add in like some music or some sound effects or whatever you want to do, and then you can set the end frame, the start frame and the end frame. So because I got rid of frame 1, we're going to turn the end frame down to 249. And now that's just about a 10-second frame animation. So now we can render this to a final video. So you can first click on this button here to set an output, and I'll just save it to my desktop. Then here in the file format, I'll use FFmpeg video, and let's open up the encoding here, and I'll use MPEG-4, and on the audio codec, I'll use 8.264, and I'll use medium quality and good. And then if you have any audio, I like to use AAC. In this case, I'll use no audio because I haven't added any audio. So then you can click on render, and you can render the final animation. And there is the final animation, so that's going to wrap it up for this tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to purchase the finished project files and help support the channel, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. And you can also help support the channel each month by joining the YouTube memberships. So if you join the YouTube memberships, then you'll get some cool perks here on YouTube and you'll be supporting the channel monthly. And if you enjoyed this video, you can also leave a tip by using the super thanks feature here on YouTube. And to watch more fall and autumn themed tutorials, definitely check out my fall autumn theme blender tutorial playlist where you can watch some more fall tutorials. So I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you for watching.